We're back. Welcome back, everybody. Bits and Bytes podcast here. We're excited to be back in the studio with everyone towards the end of the year. Man, this year flew by. Episode number 15 coming live at you. We got a great guest with us today. I'm Matt Scott, my co-host.
Joey Wensler, and it is an absolute honor and treasure to have another CEO on the show, Matt. Can you believe it?
I mean, who doesn't want to be on here?
I'm getting hyped. We have Brian Braumeyer, CEO at Opscura, with us today. We're talking all things OT security, Matt.
Yep. Brian, thanks for being here. Welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yep. So just so you know, and I know I didn't mention this before, but 15 is my lucky number. It was my number in baseball. If you've played any sports, you're probably got some like superstitions and stuff. So I always had to be 15. So this is going to be our best episode yet. I feel it. Brian, we appreciate you making some time out of your busy schedule. We know you got a lot going on, but we've spent some good time together over the last several months, and we're really excited to share what Opscura is bringing out to the market and, discussing OT security and what that means and why all of a sudden is this becoming such a major focus and should be a major focus for companies in the environment today. Brian, why don't you maybe, before we jump into things, give us a little bit about you, like, who you are, your company, like your background. How'd you get here?
How'd I get here? Well, I'd like to thank Cisco WebEx for that. Joking aside, so I'm Brian Braumeyer, CEO out of Chicago, Illinois. Been in tech for 25 plus years, focused in cybersecurity. And my tenure has taken me from running a consulting company, similar to what Pipeworks does, to being the CISO for a national managed services company. And I've got an interesting background in that I used to be a CISO that didn't understand what OT was. It wasn't part of the talk tracks. People weren't discussing it. It wasn't at the conferences. And I was tangentially aware of some of the devices like the PLCs and the touchscreens, the HMIs, but it wasn't a topic of discussion. And many CISOs are being thrown into this role where they're now being responsible and made responsible for having to protect and understand these environments. So I've had to make the evolution that a lot of my customers and colleagues are having to go through.
And just so you know, Brian, and I hope this isn't frowned upon, but it's reality. It's not on the highest level of priorities for a lot of companies, but it's being forced there because of the vulnerability and the gap, that it presents. So I would say majority of folks that we talk to outside of folks that, have either had an incident or maybe didn't have a security incident, had something go down and it, caused their environment to, be delayed or caused impact to the business itself. Now it became a priority. That, and, let's be real, honestly, that happens a lot. When you're in a role, you have your plans and then you get punched in the face. Right. And then you're like, okay, well,
And then you're Jake Paul and you end up winning a fight on Netflix.
yeah. So, that's interesting. So you sat in the seat, Brian, of, the customers that we're talking to now and felt their pain. So that's great. How long have you been with Opscura?
So I've been with Opscura for about 2 years. So
Okay.
traditionally in the IT world, started out doing security engineering work at Discover Card up in the Riverwoods, Illinois. Did some work in the electronic medical record space, and then started a consulting company. I started it when I was about 15 and out of my parents' house and grew it into a well-known business in the Chicago area, and did that for about 20 years.
That's great. That's great. So let's talk about this. So we both hit on why it hasn't been a top priority. Why is this a priority now? So why should people care about operational technology in their IT environment? Help us out.
First of all, I think it's important to even talk about what is OT.
Yep.
And many people, I was just at a security conference last night, security dinner, talked about OT, and other CISOs that I was speaking with didn't know what OT was. So I think half the battle that we have in this industry is people don't even know it's something they need to protect. So OT is operational technology. And what is it? Well, OT is cyber physical systems. Gartner spends most of their money on marketing, coming up with new names and helping the industry understand problems. And they branded this industry cyber physical systems. They like to talk about it as a new category to kind of rebrand it and to make awareness better. But when you break it down, it's pumps, it's valves, it's machines like conveyor belts at the airport that move your baggage around. It's power systems that get you power to your house. It's water and water treatment and wastewater treatment. It's all the stuff that really makes the world work. Think about trains. I mean, all the communication from the train stations to the trains, how the tracks move, the trains themselves. That's all OT. And I don't think people necessarily correlate the things that they do in the real world with those items, but OT is all around us. I think the differentiation is IT is really about the data, your laptops, your iPads, your web servers, your cloud. But OT is really what makes technology power the things that you and I are familiar with day to day.
Yep. And that OT nowadays used to be without connected to IT, but now that OT is somewhat dependent on IT. So, the way that I think about it, to your point, you talk about the plants and the, manufacturing lines and such. So all of that is connected to the network and is, spitting out data, spitting out production numbers, even leveraging AI to say, how can we, build efficiencies into this production? And then all of a sudden, the network goes down. And so your OT that was once exclusive, independent on its own, because for years I worked at Rubbermaid and we had several manufacturing plants, and they were plants that were from decades ago and machinery that was, dependent on itself. But as I was leaving, we were getting it connected into the network. We were getting it, up to communicating outwardly rather than just running independently. And then all of a sudden, where we were going, tying it back, is the network goes down. And then your OT device goes down. And I often think about it too when we're thinking about this specific thing is my refrigerator right now is connected to my network. My laundry machine and dryer are connected to my network. All of these devices that were once independent on themselves are now right here controlled by IT, right? And so
Think about that. Like your washing machine, if someone were to break into all the washing machines remotely and just tell them to fill up with water continuously, they could flood your house.
right?
Your thermostat that's connected to the internet, that's an OT, IoT device, and it controls heat. And if you were to just continuously call for heat without regard to the actual temperature in the house, it could cause a health problem. So those are some basic examples of it. But things are getting more and more connected. You look at some of the examples in the past when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. A lot of the warfare that was happening then was cyber physical. So they're breaking into the power systems, they're breaking into the trains and causing infrastructure challenges. And even the current conflict that's going on right now, that's a lot of what's being fought. I think a challenge that we had here in the US and an advantage is we're very hungry for automation and adoption, which is great. It adds to efficiency, but companies are adopting technology in many cases faster than they understand the ramifications of the security implications of the adoptions. So they think about, oh, great, I'm going to add a sensor or sensors to my manufacturing process. And one thing that companies are focusing on now is Industry 4.0, essentially using technology and AI and all these cool toys to power their business better. Example would be, let's say you've got a machining tool, and it's cutting into metal. You have a drill bit, and you can then put a microphone into that device, use AI to predictively tell when that drill bit's going to fail, when it's going to shatter. And instead of letting it shatter and causing damage to the part that it's making, having to shut the machine down, you can predictively tell when it's going to fail and change it during a planned down window. Sounds great. But now you're taking a thing, a device, a computer, and you're putting it into a network that probably isn't designed from a security architecture to secure it, to support it. And so you've got this business driver, but you've always got to keep in the back of your mind, how do I make sure that I'm supporting from a security and architecture perspective the business drivers that I want to get?
Yep, absolutely. And I don't see us going back. We're only moving forward, right? And we're only going to be more and more dependent upon OT devices supported, engaged with IT devices, right?
Yes.
So, and then of course, Gardner and all these other agencies didn't do us any favors by introducing IoT, right? Acronym, because I think there's some confusion within that too. Oh yeah, I know what OT is. Well, actually, you might not fully know what it is. You might think you know a piece of that, but start thinking about your business and what is dependent, on driving your business. And that's really where you get to the OT end of it.
Yeah, just to back it up a bit, I was just thinking to put on my SMB hat. Let's just say I'm an owner, and I'm like, holy cow, I'm listening to this podcast, this amazing Bits and Bytes podcast with Brian Brahmeyer, and I don't even know where to start. Like, I feel like I'm one of these people that shares all these new responsibilities. I'm putting on this hat myself. Brian, what do I do? Like, what's the first tangible step I take?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a great question, Joey. So first, I think mapping to a framework is really important. On the OT side, you've got NIST, CSF, you've got 800-171, you've got IEC 62443, you've got Purdue model. There's lots of different standards. I personally like the 62443 model, and that's something that you can combine a framework and a consultancy team together to help drive a roadmap. Because instead of trying to figure this thing out one piece at a time, kind of piecemeal, following a framework is a great process to allow a company to continually map to a standard. And the standard will evolve over time, but you're already down that lane. It'll tell you, things like understand what's in your network.
Yeah.
And then it talks about starting to separate assets or devices inside your network. So you don't want to have your IT devices or your accounting computers to be able to directly talk to your drills and your conveyor belts and your warehousing systems. That's a security issue. So starting to separate your plant floor of the process from the IT side. Then that's step one. Understand what's there and then separate those. I think that the air gapping concept, it used to be the gold standard. But what people are finding now is, in reality, air gaps are impossible. And because that's where the Industry 4.0 comes in. If you're air gapping, I think there's two things I'd like to dive into for that. One, you can't get any Industry 4.0 data. So if you're air gapped, you can't get the analytics. You can't tie the ERP system to your plant floor. You can't get the machine data into the cloud to do the AI analytics. But even more basically, you should assume that your plant is already breached. The assumption that you're going to be breached at some point is where every company should start. I think that's a really a healthy point of starting the conversation is, let's assume that I've already gotten breached. So a great example about air gap networks, you have remote workers who come in to maintenance. So maybe the CNC machine that you bought from DMG Mori or Mazak, some of those manufacturers, the maintenance technician has to come in and run some updates or tuning. Well, he's got a laptop and he plugs into your network. Well, your air gap network just got touched by something from the outside. And worse, he's got his cell phone with him. He's like, I need to check something. So now he just injected internet into your air gap network. So I would always assume that the air gap network's going to get pierced at some points on purpose or on accident. So I think air gap networks used to be a good standard. And I hate the example, but I'll share it anyways. Stuxnet. That's when the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility was breached, completely air gapped, or so what they thought. No phone lines, no internet, completely cut off from the outside, deep in a bunker. How do they pierce it? They pierced it using USB sticks. They dropped USB sticks in the parking lot, and the workers picked them up and plugged them in. And
So brilliant.
that's what pierced the super high security establishment, was just curiosity. And they were able to, without seeing anything, use some malware specially designed for OT to break the things that were happening inside the plant. That's very sophisticated nation state threat actor behavior. But just an example of, I would assume that any air gap is already or will be pierced at some point.
Mm-hmm.
All right. When there's a will, there's a way, right?
So let's explain a little bit more on how we take that to the next level. If air gapping or, basically putting that barrier in there was the way formerly looked at to do it, the way to do it now is more
It's more methodical. I think you
policy-based, permission-based, breaking it out into, smaller different networks that work amongst themselves and rule-based.
absolutely right, Matt. So you chop up OT and IT, and then you decide what's allowed to cross that barrier or that DMZ. And then you start chopping up the plant itself into different areas. You're doing network segmentation, basic IT stuff.
Yep.
Which can be very challenging in OT, but you take, you're a brewer. You're going to have different components or processes inside your plant. You're going to have a brewing station where water comes in, and you're adding yeast and barley and wheat to make the malt, and then you're boiling it. Then you're letting it cool. It's going to sit in different tanks, and you might do some other things to it. You've got bottling, and you're doing a washing station on the bottles, and then you need to do filling, and then you need to put the cap on, and you need to put them in the packaging, and you need to store them. So those could all be different compartmentalized processes that don't necessarily need to talk to each other. But each of them is a network of things, devices that do talk to each other. And so when you've got something like filling, you've got conveyor belt, you've got liquid going into the bottles, that's all a process. But that part of the process probably doesn't care much about boiling the water. That's a completely different spot. So when the technician is doing maintenance, you want them to limit the blast radius or the capability to have something bad happen. So if a threat comes in or an accident happens, somebody turns on internet inside that cell, it doesn't take the entire plant down. It takes an isolated process down.
Wow. Two things there, Brian. One, you got me wanting a beer. Two, they may have turned my lager into a sour, which I'm okay with, but not a lot of people are, especially the people footing the bill for all the grain, the barley, the hops, everything it takes. My wife's cousin is a brewer in San Antonio, and the Instagram post alone that he does, just showing what it takes to brew the beer we drink. I take it lightly. I had no idea how much goes into this. Imagine not only the money loss, but the man hours lost, the morale lost, and over time, what a PR nightmare, right? Your customers don't care how it happened. They just care that you don't have what they want. And that's the bottom line.
I mean, it doesn't take much to get you thinking about beer. No, not at all. Oh, it was real quick there. So I'm kind of thirsty myself now that you've brought that into my mind even more. But so this seems really important because we want Joey to get his beer, right? And it's probably important to these companies as well. So let's talk a little bit about like regulatory compliance. Like, I mean, typically when things are of this level of importance, it should be important, but oftentimes from a government perspective or an industry perspective, we want to make sure that it's important because it can really affect businesses and their bottom line. So what's some of the driving forces behind that, Brian?
So speaking of beer and speaking of the Atlanta area, there's a pretty big, busy beverage company that's in your neck of the woods. And part of Coca-Cola's secrets are how they make the beverages. And embedded into the OT networks is that formula. So not only can it cause downtime that should be important for customers, but customers that have trade secrets, have proprietary information or formulas, that's all stealable if you break into the OT network and collect the code. So you can get the recipe on how to make these things by piercing the networks. And you're talking about why and the regulatory and those drivers. Think about the example of Bassett Furniture. So Bassett Furniture is a publicly traded company, and the SEC put out some regulation that says if you're a publicly traded company and you have a material event around cybersecurity, you must disclose it to shareholders. And I think it's really important for a couple reasons. One, it's going to potentially affect the business, and shareholders need to know about that. But also, I think people are just afraid and scared to talk about cybersecurity and talk about breaches. They happen all the time. So Bassett Furniture got hacked. They had to make one of these 10K disclosures. And unfortunately, 30 days later, they had to make the same or similar disclosure explaining that they were still down. So think about this. What would you guys do, or what think customers that are listening, if you couldn't do your core operation for 30 days?
So people are losing their jobs.
Start looking for one.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
like, because that's how you put money in the bank is your core manufacturing process. So
Your email's down. I mean, that's really important. But if you can't get your core product out the door, that's much more impactful, and hackers are realizing that. And that's what's starting to drive some of this regulatory. In the IT world, the insurance companies were really the drivers behind the most recent security wave in IT. Hackers were coming in, they were doing ransomwares, $100 a pop, $1,000 a pop, $10,000 a pop, and businesses were like, wait a second, I need to get insurance for this. And all they did was buy insurance at that time, most. And what happened was insurance companies started to make lots of payouts, and it was becoming unprofitable. So what do insurance companies do? Insurance companies came back and they said, well, you need to know more about what you're doing to secure your IT networks. You need to be doing good and healthy things. I need to see that you're using MFA. I need to see that you've got monitoring tools, SIM, MDR, XDR, all these best practices. And if you don't, your insurance premiums are going to go through the roof, or I'm going to drop you. And that forced companies to think about security in a very different way. And they started adopting multi-factor authentication and generally good things to do, primarily driven through insurance. The same thing is happening now with the OT world. As businesses are breached, they're going back to not only their cyber policies, but in many cases, their business interruption policies incorrectly, because the insurance companies and the businesses might not even know that the reason that they went down was cyber, but they're using their business interruption insurance because the plant turned off. And maybe one or both parties, insurance company or the company, doesn't know, and they put it back on that policy. So the same thing is happening again. Insurance companies are coming back and saying, man, Joey, what are you doing in your plant, in your process to protect it? And if the answer is nothing or very limited, premiums are going up, or they're dropping the companies from being capable of getting cyber and or business interruption insurance, which is now starting to drive more adoption in some of these companies.
Wow, that was a fantastic analysis. I was going to ask, like, where's the tension between getting insurance or just upgrading to the latest and greatest? And you just answered that great.
yeah, and I have to think, like, to your point, as you're walking through it, these insurance companies that aren't cybersecurity,
They don't.
experts, out of the gates, they're probably are now because of the nature of the pain that they felt. But originally they thought it was an IT issue, and they're like, hey, you need to put all these procedures around your IT. And then the pain kept growing because the real pain is in the manufacturing and the capabilities of producing. So they're like, wait, we've put all these vulnerability protection procedures in place, but yet we're still getting shut down on our operating infrastructure. And so it makes a lot of sense. And so leads me to kind of the next area that I wanted to bring up. And when we're talking about it, it sounds relatively simple. It's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, we need to go, create a plan against this, and yeah, we should be able to do this. But it's not that easy. There's some complexity. There's challenges into it, and let's be real. As we started this conversation, like, at the point in this conversation where we're like, why isn't every company doing this? But as we started this conversation, we said this isn't the top priority to a lot of these CISOs or CIOs, et cetera, because they have all this other priorities on their plate. So thinking about the OT security aspect of it, it's quickly assimilating to a top priority, but it's not as easy as it sounds, right, Ryan? So help us understand a little bit about the complexities, the challenges, the cost, et cetera, that this can put in front of somebody that's looking to do it.
I'm a firm believer that if you open a conversation to try to sell security by itself, you're going to fail. Most companies aren't going out there saying, I just want to buy security. Many companies will have a conversation around cost savings or around efficiency or around something. Cost and risk, I think, is really what everything boils down to. And if you can figure out how to crack that code, how to crack that language, I think that's where you start getting traction with internally and with customers. So if you're saying, hey, security is really important, you should do security. It's a kind of a flat conversation. But if you can tie cybersecurity back to efficiency or cost savings or cost takeout, I think then you're cooking with gas. So one of our customers is a tier one automotive. And for them, they've got about 300 plants. Yeah, this is an enterprise example, but same thing applies with smaller numbers to smaller companies. They've got 300 plants, and downtime for them is super expensive. Average downtime cost for an automotive customer is about $2 million an hour. And for them to do security in OT, they estimated that the self-imposed downtime, not the cost of the new equipment, not the consulting cost, just purposely turning plants off to do the security stuff, was $750 million to $1.25 billion. It's a bananas number. And so that's, I think, what the root of the issue is the transformation is very expensive. It's very complicated. And that's part of the problem is it's just hard to do. It's hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to get started. Joey was asking in the beginning, like, where do you get started? Well, it's hard because a lot of the technique in the past has been IT type approaches for OT. And the cure is just worse than the disease. And you look at this and you say, well, all right, average cost of ransomware is in the millions for larger companies and maybe hundreds of thousands for smaller companies. And you're talking about a $750 million downstroke. Just pay the ransom. Like, in terms of cost and risk, it's like, well, I know I'm going to be down and create this problem, or maybe I just pay the ransom. And I'd never recommend that, but that's a math example. The math is just wrong. And so, yeah, you got old stuff in OT. You've got devices that their IP addresses are literally written into, embedded, and can't be changed. And you've got devices that are running Windows XP. You guys remember Windows XP, Windows 2000, Windows 3.1.1? What, like, blast from the past. But that stuff still works. So if you tell a business owner, hey, I want you to change this because it's got a security vulnerability in it, and you need a new laser cutter for $2 million, it's really challenging to get them to say yes to that because that still works. The useful life is much longer in OT than the security life. You've got your phone that maybe you keep for 3 years, maybe 2 years, and you upgrade to the latest model. Maybe it's 5 years. And in OT, the devices last 24 years.
Accounting wise, they're depreciated accordingly, right? Because they're major purchases by the size of the cost, and they're expected to, and financially calculated to deliver X amount of value over X amount of years, and the cost is depreciated, for that. I'm doing managerial.
No, I know. It's making my head hurt. It's okay.
But you're right. And, Brian, you're bringing me back because in another life, in another role that I had a lot of time in various factories, and I saw a lot of lines, and they were 40, all of them were like 30 to 40 years, if not older, manufacturing lines, and held together by like chewing gum. Like, I mean, these plant managers knew how to make it work and limit the downtime. If something went down, they would learn how to fix it on the fly. It might not be the right fix, but it was the band-aid to make sure that the line was, still going and stuff. So, you're right that the OT environment, it has a longer, much longer shelf life that is looked at, and impact as well on the overall bottom line of the business if it's down. So
The goals are very different and the language is very different. It's like two people that don't speak the same language in the same room. It's starting to converge, but the goals of IT are really around security, and the goals of OT are around keeping the production running. And what you really need is you need a translator in the middle that could talk to both sides. Therapist, translator, you pick the word, and help them come together and figure that out. I think that's, plug Byteworks here. Byteworks is a great example of that understands the difference between IT's goals and needs and OT's goals and needs, and then can deploy something that's a strategy, get everybody bought in, help each side understand the goals and those differences in language. Because if you go into the plant and say, I'm going to roll out security, they're like, absolutely not. I don't want any of that. But you go into the plant and say, I'm going to help keep the plant running more consistently. I'm going to help keep the ships coming in and out at the right times and make sure that you're not having to spend extra time at the plant because the plant line went down and you still got to get stuff out the door. And I want to get you home to your family on time. That's a completely different conversation, but they're the same thing.
Yeah, they're stoked about that. It's all about hitting people with what they care about.
The practical stuff, right? The 9-to-5ers like you and me.
Yep. And so, we've talked a lot about the problem, right? And the impact that this issue or lack of investment into it. I want to talk a little bit about the Opscura solution, right? So where does Opscura fit into solve for the help within their OT connecting to the IT environment? Let's talk about that, Brian.
So the approach that we have is different than a traditional IT approach. The approach that we use is software-defined networking, or SDN. And the way that SDN works, and SDN's been around for a long time in the IT world, in the WAN, the wide area network side, the internet side. Software-defined networking creates different layers inside the network synthetically using software. So it allows you to take the industrial network that makes all the plant stuff function and separate or add on to it a control layer or a security layer. So you can leave your plant completely flat. And, we talked to a number of plants during COVID where unfortunately those people you talked about a couple minutes ago that knew the plant, inside and out, they passed away. And it was institutional knowledge that was inside their head. And the plant continues to function, but no one has any idea how it works. We talked to a major airlines recently that TSA is pushing change, encryption, segmentation inside the airports. And their baggage handling system at one of the airports that we discussed was built in the 70s. They have no idea how the thing actually functioned. Like the software, the people that wrote it, these people are not around any longer. And so they're faced with this, how do I secure this thing that is very challenging, very complex, and very expensive to have to secure in the old way? A lot of people just don't do anything, or they use some very basic things. Software-defined networking hits it right on the head. It solves that problem of you don't need to change the control. So give you a direct example. traditionally, you've got these devices in the network called PLCs, or programmable logic controllers, and HMIs, or human machine interface. And those are the touch panels that you touch and make things in the plant function. Well, all those things have to talk, and they talk using IP addresses and software. Well, if you don't know how to get into the devices and modify that code everywhere correctly as you're updating these IP addresses, you're going to break your plant. And so that's a highly specialized thing to do. Software-defined networking allows you to keep all that programming safe. So you don't need to dive deeply into the devices and still can get the security outcomes you're looking for by layering it on top using software-defined networking. So you can get to the outcome faster. And most importantly, you can limit the downtime to somewhere between nothing and very, very minimal. So our technology, you can unplug and plug in some of the Ethernet wires. We see how the plant functions. We visualize that for the customer and the consultant. And then you can just enable protection. And it's all software-based. So you can meaningfully do something that might take a couple of years and not only, millions of dollars of consulting and hardware, but also mitigate that big cost that people often forget about, which is the downtime for the plant. You can move from an unsecure flat network to a secure network very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And from what I've experienced through our collaboration and partnership, with ease, right? I mean, it's not easy, but with ease, right? So I know from direct customer feedback that working with Byteworks and Opscura to do these rollouts, it was for the most part pain free. It's not shutting down their environment. It's not putting them through, having to do hard switchovers and stuff. But to your point, it gives them an operational leg up too from having to, have these, unique IP addresses all over. So,
And for having to manage off, like older assets, I think are really important. Back to that laser cutter example, you're hard pressed to convince a business owner to throw away something that works, especially on the plant floor. And so, you separate your OT and your IT network. You define your, the network segments based on cells. But then you start getting into the crown jewels or the legacy assets and start very selectively protecting those. So if you've got Windows XP, our technology can protect it. So you can make Windows XP secure again on the network, or Windows 2000 secure again on the network, or devices that are talking that don't know how to use encryption can all of a sudden now do that using software-defined networking. So that goes back to cost. You don't need to throw away the working $2 million asset to pass the vulnerability scan to get rid of the vulnerabilities. You can use software-defined networking, like our technology, to mitigate those risks.
and one of the things that I thought was really unique and cool of rolling out this technology, and Obi, a gentleman that works with you, used this example is he made things invisible. He made the OT end of it invisible to anybody that gets in there. They can't see it. It's not, they're unaware of what the environment looks like, which I think is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the safety net, right? Of if you don't know what they got, you can't get into it. It really is a kind of a unique positioning once you kind of start to dive into the capabilities of Obscura. So we talked a lot about manufacturing. We talked about the impact on utilities, but I started thinking about healthcare. Imagine I'm sitting in a facility and I'm dependent on a ventilator that's running on the network. And we use the analogy sometimes we're not saving lives, but in healthcare, you are saving lives, right? So there's some vulnerabilities in there. So real quick, as we're wrapping up here, who should care about OT security? Who is the segment, if you had to say the top 5 priorities of customer type that, should start thinking about making sure that their OT environment is secure, what would you say those top 5 are?
there are companies and categories that have regulatory requirements, like NERC, SIP, and Power. We have some customers that we're working with together in that particular space. They don't have a choice. The regulatory requirements are pushing that. So power is one. Water,
Utilities. Yep.
utilities, power, water. Manufacturing is probably the biggest category because that cost of downtime for them, if their plant goes down, they're going to have major problems. Not only getting products out the door, but contractual obligations they might have with the upstream vendors that they have, customers. Healthcare is also important. Healthcare has, you're directly dealing with life. But think about also manufacturing, the same thing. If you've got nitrogen and you're storing that and it somehow gets released into the plants, you kill people. So safety systems that are built into these plants and the things that happen inside of a plant might not seem like it's a safety issue, but many plants are controlled by automation. A robot arm that's doing something moves in the wrong way, it can hurt someone. So manufacturing is important. Automotive is another big one because of the cost of downtime. It's part of that manufacturing category, but specifically for them, cost is quite high. Healthcare is great too. You think about your CT scanner or your MRI machine. Those aren't cheap. And a lot of them, the touch panels are based on Windows XP. And so having to extend the capital value of an asset is something that would be very helpful for a customer while keeping it secure.
Thinking logistic too, right? So if you got a lot of pieces moving, movement is money.
Yep.
Smooth movement, efficiency is money. Time down, less efficiency is cost, right? So cool. Well,
Before we go, Brian, I had one last question.
Yeah.
Give me the 2 or 3 best places in Chicago to get a Chicago hot dog.
So there's a great place by me, Frank's Red Hots. It's Red Hot Branch, actually. And it's underneath the L. There's a couple locations. It's $3.50 for a hot dog and fries. And it's got free parking. Cash only. So bring your cash. That's probably the number one place. Honestly, after I've had that, I really don't get anywhere else.
I gotta say, an Italian beef sandwich. I got a little bit of love for Portillo's on the Italian beef sandwiches in Chicago are insane as well. Sounds
Good.
I've never had a Frank's Red Hot, but I'm gonna try that the next time I'm up there.
I put that on everything.
You do?
I do.
That's where you're so hot and
Always hot and bothered.
and flavorful.
Because I just put it on every. I douse it with Frank's.
That's awesome.
Yep.
That's great. Brian, we really appreciate you coming out, making some time for us. I think it's important. This is a very important conversation for our listeners to start thinking about if they're not already. We're excited for the movement that we've seen from a lot of our customers. I think there's so much more to come, but man, we got numerous customers that are doing POCs, numerous customers that are exploring the concept and the thought. And I think that that's only going to snowball. So thanks for making a difference, Brian, over there at Opscura. Byteworks is a proud partner, and we're ready to go grow this with you and make our customers safer. So I really appreciate you on behalf of Bits and Bytes. Brian, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I'll leave everybody with one thought. The time to do this stuff is now. And if any of this sounds interesting, talk to Byteworks. We can get looped into a conversation. The automation and the AI that you want to have is probably closer than you think. But putting these things in place now is the time to build that foundation. So look forward to continuing the conversation, guys.
Yeah, man, we look forward to it too. All our customers, if you need more information, you know where to go. We're excited to help you out with this. And Opscura has innovation in this category that you don't want to miss. So let's do it. Bits and Bytes 15.
Woo! Thanks, guys.